Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Leadership Lab Notes. I'm Caitlin, your podcast host and advisor at IG Advisors. As a reminder, Leadership Lab Notes is a limited edition podcast series where we discuss all things impact leadership. At IG Advisors, we are a strategy consultancy working with the philanthropy, business, and nonprofit sectors for social and environmental change. We are coaches, mentors, and leaders ourselves, and we run the very popular Leadership Lab program, which is a 6-week training for social and environmental impact professionals looking to level up their practical leadership skills as well as their professional career plan and personal brand. You can learn more about the lab in the link in the description of this video. Today, we're going to be talking about leadership and data. So we all know that there are lots of soft skills that go into being a good leader, but there are also lots of really practical resources, tools at our disposal that help us make informed decisions, influence others, and lead well. So I'm very excited to be talking about data today because it feels very relevant. And I'm joined by a very special guest, as always. So today we are speaking to the wonderful Elizabeth Anderson, who was actually a past participant in our Leadership Lab program. And do you want to introduce yourself, Elizabeth?
Yeah, sure.
Tell our
Hi.
viewers a bit more.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Elizabeth Anderson. As Caitlin said, I am the Senior Research and Evaluation Manager for the Freedom Fund, which is a global nonprofit based out of the UK. I've been with the Freedom Fund for about 3 years, managing our various research and evaluation projects all around the world. And yeah, I'm very excited to be speaking with you today, Caitlin.
Amazing. Okay, so before we dive into some of the trickier, juicier questions I have lined up for you, could you just tell our viewers about your leadership style? How would you describe the way you lead, and how, if at all, does data play a role in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that something that is specific to being a researcher in the research management space is that I work with a team of also extremely talented researchers and people who know the answers a lot of the time or who know an answer that I don't necessarily know. And I will rely on those people. So I think my own leadership style is a lot more democratic than necessarily fits other like work areas or other job titles within the space. But I think that works really well is to be making joint decisions in a way that recognizes everyone's experience and where they come from and their own research skills.
I love that. And it's very similar actually to the way that we lead at IG Advisors and recognizing the wisdom that you have on your team, and especially having a team of researchers that's next level access to knowledge and up to date information. So, speaking of information, how does data play into the way you work as a team, the way you are and show up as a leader?
Yeah, sure. That's interesting. I might have you repeat some parts of that to make sure I covered them all. Um, so in the most practical terms, what we do is data management and data collection, right? And we tell other people, I think a big part of what my job is and what my team's job is to tell other people at the organization what the data mean, right? And what does it mean when we say 50% of these people said X, Y, and Z? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for them? What does it mean for the beneficiaries of our various nonprofit programming? Um, in terms of like the actual team, I think we rely a lot on kind of some internal metrics in addition to your KPIs, your key performance indicators for the organization. We have some within our team that are particularly special to us in terms of how we're benchmarking our own progress. So things like the number of publications that we're able to produce per year, the reach of those, how many clicks, how many downloads is each thing getting, how many things get picked up for podcasts. That sort of data is really valuable for us to know if we are hitting the goals that we've set for ourselves in terms of the reach. We also really try to benchmark the quality of the things that we put out, the various pieces of research and evaluation. Again, in terms of who's reading it, what kind of feedback we're getting, whether or not we're meeting our own internal standards for the quality. Everything from copy editing to having accompanying images that reflect who we are as the Freedom Fund. And that we're able to benchmark those in a way that is, it's qualitative, but it's still data. and that we're being consistent, and that we're looking for areas to grow based on the feedback that we get, and where feedback in my world is data.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm hearing a lot of really interesting themes come through. So one is around how useful data is for influencing. You mentioned being able to take data to different people internally, externally, and that's a huge benefit of taking a data-driven approach. You also mentioned how useful data is for tracking progress against objectives, driving a team towards a target, and also for accountability. You were talking about quality control, and if you have data, it allows yourselves, but also other stakeholders, to really interrogate and explore the work that you're doing, which I love. And I really appreciate the way you drew out the role of qualitative data, because yes, there are stats and objectives that you can, and KPIs that you can use to track how your team is doing, how your organization is doing. But there is also that softer part, that more, how do you understand a company culture? How do you understand people's relationship to each other on your team? How do you understand whether people feel happy and satisfied in their role? And definitely statistics play a role in understanding that, but there are stories that help you understand that and fill in that picture. So that makes, I feel like you're speaking to a lot of benefits and advantages of taking a data-driven approach. I'm interested in, what challenges have you faced? Is there anything that data has been a blocker for?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, we'd kind of touched on that before the interview as well, but, or the podcast as well. But I kind of think that people often perceive that there's sometimes like a disconnect between, well, the data say this, but my intuition says this, and my leadership skills and just say this other thing. But I think when that happens, when you come up with this clash, that actually is its own interesting answer to your question. So what is it? What is the data telling me that conflicts with what I already believed? Because typically, as the leader, you're in some way already an expert on that issue, right? And so if it's not passing the sniff test, right, or what scientists would call the face validity of the result, then maybe you asked the wrong research question. Maybe you analyzed the data wrong. Maybe you forgot an element. So I don't know. So say if you're looking at staff retention over time, did you remember, maybe you didn't do it by, race and gender and tenure at the organization and all of these other things. Maybe you've missed a factor. And that tells you something about yourself and your own leadership, that you overlooked this particular thing when you were asking the research question. It may be that the question that you asked when you were collecting the data was not the right question. And so that may be the answer as well, if it doesn't match up with what you knew to be true or felt to be true. So I don't know that I necessarily think that it's a downside, as it's an unexpected extra layer of work in uncovering what you wanted the data to tell you, either to confirm something that you already thought or tell you some new information.
That's such an interesting way of framing, and an interesting lens to apply to that commonly heard challenge that we hear around listening to the data versus trusting instincts. And what I'm hearing from you is, actually, it's not either or, it's look at both of them together and then interrogate if they're not matching up. Why is that? And that in itself is really, really useful and valuable information for decision making. I think that's a really useful lens to apply to that conundrum. Another stereotype that I often hear is, you have data-driven approaches over here, and then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have more creative, emotionally driven approaches to doing things. And I'm interested in your experience of that. Does that spectrum exist? Is that something that you interrogate and ask yourself about and explore in the way that you use data and do research?
Well, yeah. So yes, I do think it exists, but I think instead it's less of like a continuum and more of a spectrum, like a circle, right? And so everybody kind of is going to sit at a different place in terms of their own innate skill with creativity versus being able to adhere to what the data results are saying. And so that's part of the reason to have a broad leadership team that probably should include a researcher or someone who can interpret data. And then B, yeah, I don't think that they necessarily exist in conflict with each other, or that you have to, shift to one direction or the other. Um, it's From my perspective, it's more that the data that you get kind of sometimes tell you like a retrospective story about what you've created with this creative side of the process. And so it will tell you whether or not it's working and what tweaks can be made. So I think for someone who is a leader who tends to be more, lead with their gut, try creative solutions. Oftentimes the role of data is to tell you whether it worked, not whether you should try it in the first place. There are things you can do to supplement before you're taking a big creative risk. Like you said, qualitative data, talking to other people who are in the space, floating your idea by people, that is data collection. And there are ways to systematically and thoughtfully analyze the feedback that you're getting from other people, which I think for most people who are doing something, taking a risk, they don't know if it's going to work. That is part of their process typically. It's just what matter whether or not you consider that to be data, which I would, absolutely. So
I really like that point about the value of a diverse team and diverse process, and holding space for both the dreaming big, getting creative, and holding space for rigor and knowledge gathering. And the two are very intertwined and interlink and are complementary. But it's important to have both in many circumstances, and that's especially true in the world of strategy consulting that we live in. A follow-up question: you alluded to data for influencing, and a challenge that I really commonly hear. I was actually speaking to someone earlier today, and they were telling me that they'd done all this amazing research, and then they had this question about what next. So what do I do with this research? How do I get it to land with people? I think that jump from knowledge gathering and analysis and sense making through to sharing with other people and using research to trigger action is often where people have the biggest struggles and challenges. So I'd love to hear your experience of that, and if you have any top tips.
Um, that's a really good question, because unfortunately, I don't think I have a very positive answer to that. I think that is a huge problem. There is this, what, in medical sciences, we would call like the research practice gap, right? We have all of this information that's available, but it's not actually trickling down to your GP or your primary care provider, right? That those things aren't actually being taken up in clinics, even though we have a lot of information. I think that applies to research in the nonprofit sector, in, like innovative career and fields, that oftentimes a lot of the research we do kind of gets shelved. There's this kind of niche group of other researchers who say, wow, this is amazing. This was a really neat piece of work that was really needed. But then the gap to actually getting it to the field, as it were, really is pervasive. I guess my tip would be thinking at the time that you're writing up the report, who is it for? And so that's something that I think that we've done very well at the Freedom Fund, for example, is oftentimes we will do a report that is exclusively for the nonprofit who received partnership and funding from the Freedom Fund. And so we write the recommendations for them, right? And so that those are things they can take to their donors, to their local government, to all of these things, and making sure that is the perspective from language as well, right? Sometimes we will only write a report in the language that most recipients will be able to use that report. If it's really for donors, then think about that. If you're trying to raise money for a particular issue, then write the report for that. I think that oftentimes the default is kind of follow this, write it for other researchers. And ultimately those aren't the people who are going to be making those changes. And again, I think that comes back to strong organization-wide leadership, so that you've got, people who are doing this like research and evaluation leadership, working closely in tandem with PR people or communications people, who are able to think, again, more strategically than I would. Who is this for? And what is the message that they want to hear? What questions do they have that the data can answer? And then that's kind of the working backwards point.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think if you're trying to speak to everyone, you're speaking to no one. Your message isn't going to hit anyone. So that defining your audience, and then from that working out what does that audience need? What action do I want them to take off the back of this? And also what language is going to resonate and make sense. I think the Freedom Fund is very good at languages and translating research for different audiences. And I know that's something a lot of organizations struggle with. I also reflect a lot on, so often a challenge that researchers face is we've done the research, we've put our findings out there as best as we could in all these different formats, depending on the audience, where the audience is, what format they need it in. But I don't know to what extent people are actually using my research. And I often hear this sort of not getting that instant gratification of seeing very tangible actions that have been taken off the back of research. And so, one thing that I always reflect on is the process itself, and how even if the output of the research and the action that comes off the back of that may feel further removed, the impact of the process and bringing people together to discuss important topics, allowing them to build relationships in workshops, focus groups, allowing people to have their input into how data is interpreted and have ownership over the process. I think the process itself can be a really, really powerful outcome. And I'm interested in your experience of that and how you navigate the tension between wanting instant gratification. And I imagine you get that when you've written your report or whatever it is, but then not being able to see the actions that are triggered off the back of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's kind of how I got into my current job was, so I was very much more on the research side, where I was the one collecting the data, analyzing the data, writing the report, and would often be contracted by nonprofits and other organizations to do that, and just really feeling like I was missing that piece of the so what, so why does it matter that I did this? Why does it matter that I got paid salary to do this instead of providing direct funds to community in need? And that's been a really phenomenal thing about my current position, is being able to take the research directly to the people it was done for and to the people who funded it and who have interest in funding additional work in the area. And so that's just been incredibly rewarding, and I think, frankly, oftentimes quite exceptional for the nonprofits that we partner with, is to have research that is done for them, and it's not just for us and about them. And that's been really neat. In terms of the broader field, I think that is a shift that needs to happen, that we need to be a lot more conscious of who is this for and what is its immediate impact going to be. And I think oftentimes when people are applying for research grants, that's not one of the criteria from the grant making organization. It's more about, what is the potential for this to be published in a high impact research journal, or what are the policy implications and stuff. But those are outcomes that are pretty far removed from the true so what of a particular piece of research. Yeah, that's been something that I think that is going to continue changing over the course of my career, especially as we see more of a shift in quote unquote the development field from global North institutions to global South institutions, and that's something that's very near and dear to my heart, is that there are thousands or tens of thousands or even millions at this point of extremely qualified researchers who are just being kept out of kind of this historically elite research bubble, which is this cycle of you get the money, you publish the research, it goes in a journal, and then you just go around and around. And then there's people who have lived experience, who come from the communities that are being studied, have all the same research skills that I have, but are kept out of that kind of bubble. And so seeing that change is something that I'm very hopeful for in the next 20 to 30 years.
I completely agree. And I'm so happy that this has come up in our conversation, because it is so important. And we all come to data analysis with our own biases. And the more you can have a really diverse group of people around the table involved in that process doing the analysis, then the more effective your research is going to be. Okay, so we're at time. I want to, before we wrap up, 1 minute, what is your top piece of advice for anyone working in research and trying to build their leadership in the field?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had prepared a different answer, which was about leadership and then using research, but I'll.
Oh, well, can we hear that
That's
too?
good. All right, all right. And I think of
I'm like, give us all the advice.
in that time. Yeah, so for people in leadership generally, I would say that the top tip is know how to read the data. Just take some time to actually learn it. Oftentimes I think what leadership receives is like a list of bulleted like highlights of the research, or they'll receive the report, but they don't actually get a chance to dig in the data and ask meaningful questions. And it is a achievable skill. If it's a matter of taking a course, or I don't know, watching some YouTube videos, or sitting down with your director of research, to kind of be able to do that. And it's not so much that you need to be able to analyze it yourself, is that you need to be able to ask the right questions. And that is an attainable skill that will allow it to seem, I just feel like that when we're talking about like that creativity, like impulse, like lead with your, intuition gap from research, that actually is what closes that gap, is understanding. Because it just kind of, there's this sense that research, oh, it's maths, like this is not accessible. But being able to do that allows you to ask more questions with the data that you have, and then kind of merge those two areas, two extremes.
I love that. I love that advice of know what questions you need to ask at the minimum. And then if you can upskill, get the skills, it's really valuable to know how to do the data and get the data. Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for watching today's episode. Thank you so much to Elizabeth for joining us and all of those amazing insights about the world of research and the relevance of data for leadership. If you enjoyed today's video, remember to like, comment, subscribe, share on socials, tag IG Advisors, tag Elizabeth. We're going to drop her LinkedIn in the description so you can connect. And you might also enjoy our Leadership Lab program, which is a 6-week training for social and environmental impact professionals. And you can learn more on the IG Advisors website or in the description of this video. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.